The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Riverside Country Club's grand ballroom. Crystal fragments scattered like tiny diamonds across the polished stone, each piece catching the light from the massive chandelier above. But nobody noticed the broken glass. Every eye in that room of 200 guests was locked on me, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and morbid fascination. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Because 30 seconds earlier, my father had just called me a failure. In front of everyone who mattered in our town, at his own retirement celebration. My name is Sarah Brennan, and I'm 34 years old. The daughter who wasn't supposed to exist. The mistake that became a burden. The child who spent her entire life trying to prove she deserved a place at the family table, only to discover that the seat was never really mine to begin with. Standing there in my carefully chosen navy dress, the one I'd bought specifically because it was conservative enough to earn his approval, I felt the familiar sting of public humiliation wash over me. But this time was different. This time, I had something he didn't know about. Something that would turn his perfect retirement party into the beginning of his worst nightmare. The weight of the manila envelope in my purse felt like it was burning through the leather. Inside that envelope was a photograph, a birth certificate, and a DNA test that would destroy everything Robert Brennan had built. His reputation, his marriage, his precious legacy, everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how this all started, because you need to understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes. The Brennan family owns half of Millbrook, Connecticut. We're the kind of family that has a wing of the hospital named after us, a scholarship fund at the local university, and a bronze plaque on every park bench in the town square. My father, Robert Brennan, spent 43 years building Brennan & Associates into the most successful law firm in 3 counties. He specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes deals that make or break family empires. My older brother Michael followed perfectly in those footsteps. Harvard Law, summa cum laude, now a partner in the firm at 38. My younger sister Jennifer became the pediatric surgeon my father always said was healing the world one child at a time. Both of them married the right people, bought houses in the right neighborhoods, had children at the right intervals. Then there was me, Sarah, the middle child who became a veterinarian. You might think that's a respectable profession, you'd be right. But in the Brennan family, respectability wasn't enough. Success was measured in billable hours, surgical procedures that made headlines, and dinner party conversations where you could casually mention your latest 7-figure deal. Treating sick puppies and spaying cats didn't exactly fit the family brand. For 34 years, I'd felt like an imposter wearing the Brennan name. Like I was constantly auditioning for a role I was never going to get. Every family gathering was a performance review. I was destined to fail. Every conversation with my father felt like a job interview for a position that had already been filled by my siblings. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was his retirement party, and I'd spent 3 months planning the perfect tribute. I'd organized a slideshow of his career highlights, coordinated with all his old law partners to attend, and even arranged for the mayor to present him with a key to the city. I thought maybe, finally, he'd see me as more than just the disappointing middle child. I was wrong. The moment that shattered everything happened during his speech. He stood at the podium, distinguished and commanding in his tailored tuxedo, the very picture of success. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak about legacy, about family, about the things that matter most in life. When I look out at this room, he said, his voice carrying that lawyer's authority that had intimidated judges and juries for 4 decades, I see the people who have made my career possible. My colleagues, my friends, my family. He gestured toward our table, where my mother sat radiant in her emerald gown, flanked by Michael and Jennifer, their spouses, and their perfect children. I was there too, of course, but somehow his gesture seemed to skip right over me. I've been blessed with exceptional children, he continued, and my heart began to race with anticipation. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was finally my moment. Michael has taken the firm to heights I never imagined possible. Jennifer saves lives every single day at Children's Hospital. I couldn't be prouder of what they've accomplished. The pause that followed felt like an eternity. I held my breath, waiting for my name, for some acknowledgement of the successful veterinary practice I'd built from nothing, of the animals I'd saved, of the community I served. Instead, he looked directly at me with those cold blue eyes that had haunted my childhood and delivered the words that would echo in my mind forever. "I'm proud of all my children," he said, his voice somehow managing to sound both public and intimate, with the exception of the failure sitting at table 12. Table 12. My table. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the heat of 200 pairs of eyes boring into me, could sense the collective intake of breath as the crowd processed what they'd just heard. My mother's face went white as porcelain. Jennifer's mouth fell open in shock. Michael just stared at his plate, unwilling to meet my gaze. But my father? My father smiled. A small, satisfied smile that told me this wasn't a slip of the tongue or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated. This was intentional. This was his final verdict on my life, delivered with the same cold precision he'd used to destroy opposing counsel in the courtroom. That's when the champagne flute fell from my hand. That's when something inside me finally snapped. Because in that moment, I realized that no amount of success, no level of achievement, no degree of perfection would ever be enough for Robert Brennan. He had decided who I was when I was 5 years old and chose art over athletics, when I was 16 and picked veterinary science over pre-law, when I was 25 and opened my own practice instead of joining the family firm. I was the family failure, the disappointment, the one who didn't fit the mold. But here's what he didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. I had spent the last 6 months uncovering a secret that would redefine everything we thought we knew about the Brennan family. A secret that started with a simple question about why I looked nothing like my siblings and ended with a private investigator, a DNA test, and a truth so explosive it would blow apart my father's carefully constructed world. The manila envelope in my purse contained proof that Robert Brennan, the man who'd just publicly humiliated me, wasn't just a hypocrite, he was a fraud. And the failure he'd just dismissed in front of 200 people was about to become the most powerful person in that room. Because sometimes, the child who doesn't fit the family mold is the only one strong enough to tear it down. The Brennan family home sits on 12 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, a sprawling Georgian colonial that has graced the pages of Architectural Digest twice. Built in 1847 by my great-great-grandfather, it represents 5 generations of accumulated wealth, influence, and carefully curated respectability. The circular driveway alone cost more than most people's houses, lined with century-old oak trees that cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Growing up in that house was like living in a museum where you were simultaneously the curator and the most fragile exhibit. Every room told a story of Brennan's achievement. The library housed first-edition law books and framed diplomas dating back to the 1800s. The formal dining room displayed silver service sets that had been used to entertain governors and senators. Even the hallways were lined with oil portraits of distinguished ancestors, their stern faces watching your every move with painted eyes that seemed to judge whether you were worthy of the family name. My childhood bedroom was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in what had once been the servants' quarters. Not because we didn't have space, the house had 14 rooms, but because my parents believed children should earn their place in the family hierarchy. Michael, being the eldest son and heir apparent, had the corner suite on the 2nd floor with windows overlooking the gardens. Jennifer, the baby and only other daughter, was given the room adjacent to my parents' master suite, close enough for nighttime comfort and morning conversations. I was given space where I couldn't be heard. The Brennan family operated on an unspoken but rigid caste system. At the top sat my father, Robert, whose word was absolute law. His decisions were handed down like judicial rulings, final and unchallengeable. My mother, Patricia, served as his perfect complement, beautiful, charming, and utterly devoted to maintaining the family's public image. She chaired charity galas, hosted political fundraisers, and appeared in the society pages with the kind of practiced grace that looked effortless but required constant vigilance. Michael learned early that his role was to be the crown prince. From the age of 5, he was groomed for leadership. Private tutors, elite prep schools, summers spent interning at the law firm. He never questioned this path because questioning wasn't part of his vocabulary. Success was a foregone conclusion, failure not even a possibility. He moved through life with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted, never had to prove his worth. Jennifer's position was different, but equally secure. As the youngest and the family's only planned daughter, she was treated like precious porcelain. Her intelligence was celebrated, her ambitions encouraged, her dreams funded without question. When she announced at age 12 that she wanted to be a surgeon, my father immediately arranged for her to shadow doctors at the local hospital. When she struggled with organic chemistry in college, he hired the best tutors money could buy. Her success was an investment that paid dividends in family pride. Then there was me, the unexpected middle child who disrupted the perfect family symmetry. I learned the rules of our household through a series of painful lessons that began before I could even properly pronounce my own name. The first rule was simple: achievements were currency, and some currencies were worth more than others. Michael's youth soccer trophies earned prime real estate on the mantelpiece. Jennifer's dance recital photos were prominently displayed in my father's office. My elementary school art awards went into a drawer in the kitchen, occasionally surfaced during spring cleaning, then quietly disappeared. The second rule was more complex. Love was conditional, and those conditions were constantly changing. You could earn approval through the right choices, the right friends, the right extracurricular activities. But that approval could be withdrawn just as quickly if you stepped out of line, showed too much independence, or, God forbid, embarrassed the family name. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I discovered this rule the hard way when I was 8 years old. I had been invited to Emma Crawford's birthday party, a seemingly innocent childhood event that became my first real lesson in family politics. Emma's father was a plumber, a perfectly respectable profession that happened to fall several social strata below the Brennan standard. When my mother found out, she sat me down for what she called a learning conversation. "Sarah, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that made her displeasure sound like disappointment. "We need to talk about the kinds of friends you choose. The Crawford family is perfectly nice, I'm sure, but they're not really our sort of people." I was 8. I didn't understand what our sort of people meant. I only knew that Emma had been kind to me when the other kids at my private school treated me like an outsider, that she shared her lunch when I forgot mine, that she laughed at my jokes instead of rolling her eyes. "But Mom, Emma is my friend," I protested, using the kind of logic that only makes sense to children. "She's nice to me." My mother's smile became strained, like she was trying to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. "Being nice isn't enough, darling. We have certain standards to maintain. The Brennan name means something in this town, and we can't be seen associating with just anyone." I went to the party anyway, sneaking out while my parents were at some charity function. Emma's house was small and cluttered, and filled with the kind of chaos that comes from a family that actually enjoys each other's company. Her parents laughed loudly and hugged frequently and asked about my day like they genuinely cared about the answer. For 3 hours, I experienced what it felt like to be in a home where love wasn't a performance, where acceptance didn't require a resume. When my parents discovered my deception, the punishment was swift and comprehensive. I was grounded for 2 weeks, forbidden from calling Emma, and enrolled in additional etiquette classes to help me understand appropriate social boundaries. The message was clear: step out of line, face the consequences. But the real punishment came later, in the form of calculated indifference. For months afterward, my mother would lavish attention on Michael and Jennifer while treating me with polite formality, like I was a houseguest who had overstayed their welcome. My father, never one for emotional subtlety, simply acted like I didn't exist. At dinner, he would ask Michael about his day, inquire about Jennifer's schoolwork, then turn to my mother without so much as glancing in my direction. This pattern continued throughout my childhood and adolescence, a carefully orchestrated campaign to teach me my place in the family hierarchy. When I made the honor roll, it was expected. When Michael made the honor roll, it was celebrated. When I scored the winning goal in field hockey, my parents were too busy at Jennifer's piano recital to attend. When Jennifer scored a winning goal in soccer, my father took a half day off work to be there. The message was always the same. You are not enough, you have never been enough, and you will never be enough. By the time I reached high school, I had learned to navigate this emotional minefield with the skill of a diplomat. I chose activities that wouldn't compete with my siblings' interests, pursued friendships that met my parents' social standards, and kept my real thoughts and feelings locked away where they couldn't be used against me. I became an expert at reading the room, at anticipating disapproval before it was voiced, at making myself invisible when visibility might cause problems. But invisibility came with its own price. The more I tried to blend into the background, the more my family seemed to forget I existed at all. Holiday photos were arranged, with Michael and Jennifer prominently featured, while I was positioned slightly behind and to the side, like an afterthought. Family vacations were planned around their schedules and interests, while my preferences were politely noted and quietly ignored. Even my high school graduation felt like a formality they attended out of obligation rather than pride. The foundation of my relationship with my family was built on quicksand, shifting expectations, conditional love, and the constant fear that one wrong move would send me tumbling into complete rejection. I learned to walk carefully, speak softly, and dream quietly. I learned that safety came from making myself small, that survival meant never asking for too much attention or taking up too much space. What I didn't learn, what I couldn't have known then, was that all families aren't built this way, that love doesn't have to be earned through achievement, that acceptance doesn't require perfection, that belonging should be a birthright rather than a privilege to be constantly defended. I wouldn't discover these truths until much later, when a chance encounter with a stranger would start unraveling everything I thought I knew about the Brennan family. When I would learn that the foundation I had spent my entire life trying to build a place on was constructed on lies so deep and so old that they had become indistinguishable from truth. But that revelation was still years away. For now, I was just a child learning to survive in a house that felt more like a courthouse than a home, where the verdict was always the same: guilty of not being enough. The decision to investigate my own family began with a medical form. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when I sat in Dr. Amanda Foster's office for my annual physical, mindlessly filling out the standard paperwork that comes with being 34 and responsible about preventative health care. The form was routine: height, weight, current medications, family medical history. I had filled out identical forms dozens of times before, always providing the same information. Father's side, heart disease and diabetes. Mother's side, breast cancer and osteoporosis. But that morning, something made me pause. Maybe it was the fluorescent lighting casting everything in stark relief. Or maybe it was the fact that I had just turned 34, the same age my mother was when she had Jennifer. Whatever the reason, I found myself really looking at the questions for the first time. Any family history of autoimmune disorders? I stared at the checkbox, pen hovering over the paper. The honest answer was that I didn't know. Despite being raised in the same house as my parents and siblings, despite 3 decades of family dinners and holiday gatherings, I realized I knew virtually nothing about our actual medical history. Dr. Foster, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, noticed my hesitation when she reviewed my forms. "Having trouble with the family history section?" she asked, settling into her chair across from me. "Not exactly," I said, then stopped. The truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. It's just, I'm not sure how accurate my information is. My family doesn't really talk about health issues. She nodded understandingly. That's more common than you'd think, especially in families that value privacy. But given some of the symptoms you've been experiencing, the fatigue, the joint pain, the digestive issues, it might be worth getting a more complete picture. The symptoms she referenced had been plaguing me for months. Nothing dramatic, nothing that interfered with my work, but persistent enough to be concerning. I had attributed them to stress, to the demands of running a veterinary practice, to the general wear and tear of life. But Dr. Foster had been gently suggesting that there might be an underlying autoimmune component. Have you ever considered genetic testing? She asked, pulling up something on her computer. Not just for health screening, but some of the commercial tests can provide family background information that might be helpful. I left her office with a requisition for comprehensive blood work and a business card for a genetic testing company. The irony wasn't lost on me. A veterinarian who routinely ordered genetic panels for purebred dogs had never thought to investigate her own genetic background. That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking Millbrook's historic downtown, staring at the genetic testing kit that had arrived with surprising speed. The process was simple. Spit in a tube, mail it back, wait 4 to 6 weeks for results. But something about it felt momentous, like I was opening a door I might not be able to close. My apartment was a deliberate contrast to the Brennan family home. Where their house was all marble and mahogany and inherited antiques, mine was filled with comfortable furniture, veterinary journals, and photographs of the animals I'd treated over the years. The walls displayed my own artwork, watercolor paintings I'd done in college, framed certificates from veterinary school, pictures of me with grateful pet owners. It was a space that reflected who I actually was, rather than who I was supposed to be. I had bought the apartment 3 years earlier, with money I'd saved from my practice, deliberately choosing a place in downtown Millbrook rather than the prestigious neighborhoods where my family expected me to live. The location put me close to my clinic and gave me the independence I craved, but it also served as a daily reminder of my separation from the family orbit. That night, as I prepared the genetic testing sample, I found myself thinking about patterns I had never consciously acknowledged. How I had always looked different from my siblings, where they were tall and angular with my father's sharp features. I was petite with softer features and darker hair. How my interests had always diverged from theirs, as if we were operating from completely different instruction manuals. How I had always felt like I was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The test kit sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally sealed it and dropped it in the mail. Even then, I told myself it was purely for medical reasons, a responsible step toward better understanding my health risks. I wasn't looking for family secrets or hidden truths. I was just trying to be a good patient. The 4 weeks that followed were filled with the normal rhythms of my life. Spring was arriving in Connecticut, bringing with it the annual surge of new pet adoptions and the inevitable emergency calls from pet owners whose animals had gotten into things they shouldn't have. My practice was thriving. I had built a reputation as someone who genuinely cared about both animals and their human families, who would take the time to explain diagnoses and treatment options in language people could understand. But even as I threw myself into my work, I found my mind wandering to that test kit, making its way through laboratory processes I could only imagine. Part of me hoped the results would be boring, confirming what I already knew about my family's medical history and putting to rest the vague sense of disconnection I had always felt. Another part of me, a part one barely acknowledged, wondered what secrets might be hiding in my DNA. The email notification came on a Thursday morning while I was performing surgery on a German Shepherd who had swallowed a tennis ball. My phone buzzed against my hip, but I was 3 hours into a complex procedure and couldn't check it. It wasn't until late afternoon, after the dog was stable and recovering, that I finally looked at my messages. Your genetic analysis results are ready for viewing. I stared at the notification, my hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of surgery. The clinic was quiet. My staff had gone home, the last patient had been discharged, and I was alone with the antiseptic smell of the surgical suite and the soft hum of medical equipment. I could have waited until I got home, could have reviewed the results in the comfort of my apartment with a glass of wine and the emotional buffer of familiar surroundings. Instead, I found myself logging into the testing company's website right there in my office, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the steady presence of animals who had always been easier to understand than people. The report was comprehensive, filled with percentages and pie charts and detailed breakdowns of ethnic heritage. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Northern European ancestry, no surprising health markers, genetic variants that explained my lactose intolerance and my tendency toward anxiety. Standard information that confirmed my family's oft-repeated stories about Irish and English ancestors who had immigrated to America in the 1800s. But there was something else, something that made me scroll back through the report twice, then 3 times, certain I was misreading the data. Under the section labeled DNA relatives, there was a match listed as a potential half-sibling. Someone named David Palmer, sharing approximately 25% of my DNA. According to the analysis, we had one parent in common. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, my mind racing through possibilities and explanations. A half-sibling meant one of my parents had another child. A child I had never heard of, never been told about, never suspected existed. The genetic testing company's algorithms were sophisticated enough to distinguish between full siblings, half-siblings, and other familial relationships with remarkable accuracy. David Palmer. The name meant nothing to me, but the implications were staggering. I clicked on his profile, which showed limited information. He was 38 years old, lived in Portland, Oregon, and had been adopted as an infant. His family medical history was marked as unknown, and he had clearly taken the test for the same reasons I had, trying to understand his genetic background and possibly connect with biological family. The timeline made my stomach clench. David was 4 years older than me, which meant he would have been born when my parents were already married, already established in Millbrook, already building the perfect family image that defined their social standing. I spent the rest of the evening researching everything I could about David Palmer. Social media profiles showed a man who worked as a high school history teacher, who coached soccer, who seemed to live a quiet, normal life 3,000 miles away from the Brennan family drama. His adoption records would be sealed, but the genetic evidence was undeniable. One of my parents had a secret child. A child who had been given away, hidden from the family, erased from our history, as if he had never existed. The question that kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my apartment while my mind churned through possibilities, was simple but devastating. Which parent was lying? The perfect Brennan family facade, the one that had been carefully constructed and maintained for my entire life, was built on a foundation of lies. And I was the only one who knew it. The decision to dig deeper wasn't really a decision at all. It was an inevitability. Once you know that everything you believed about your family is false, once you realize that the people who raised you have been living a lie for decades, you can't simply pretend that knowledge away. I hired a private investigator the next morning. The private investigator's office smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had agreed to meet me on a Saturday afternoon, away from the prying eyes of Millbrook's small-town gossip network. As I sat across from her cluttered desk, explaining why I needed someone to investigate my own family, a strange thing happened. The walls I had built around my childhood memories began to crumble, and pieces of my past started falling into place like a jigsaw puzzle finally revealing its hidden picture. "So you want me to find out which of your parents had a child they gave up for adoption," Lisa said, making notes in a leather-bound notebook. She was a woman in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes, and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd heard everything twice. "Any idea which parent we're looking at?" I started to shake my head, then stopped. Because suddenly, sitting in that tiny office with its flickering fluorescent light and stack of cold case files, a memory surfaced that I had buried so deep I'd convinced myself it never happened. I was 7 years old, hiding in the library during one of my parents' rare arguments. The Brennan household ran on a carefully maintained schedule of polite interaction and controlled emotions, so raised voices were unusual enough to send me scurrying for cover. I had crawled behind the leather sofa where my father kept his law journals, clutching my favorite stuffed rabbit and trying to make myself invisible. Their voices carried through the thin walls from the master bedroom, my mother's tone higher and more desperate than I had ever heard it. "She's asking questions, Robert. Yesterday she wanted to know why she doesn't look like the other children. What am I supposed to tell her?" "You tell her nothing," my father's voice was cold, controlled. "We agreed. That part of your life doesn't exist anymore. But she's getting older. She's starting to notice things. The way you look at her sometimes, like..." My mother's voice broke, a sound I had never heard before and wouldn't hear again for decades. "Like what, Patricia?" "Like you can't stand the sight of her." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. 7-year-old me didn't understand the words, Didn't grasp the implications, but I understood the tone. I understood that they were talking about me. That I was the problem that needed to be managed, the question that couldn't be answered. "She's not mine," my father said finally, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "She will never be mine. But she has our name, and that's enough. The rest is your burden to carry." I had pushed that memory so far down that it became like a dream, something that felt real but couldn't possibly be true. Children are remarkably good at protecting themselves from truths they're not ready to handle, and I had spent 27 years convinced I had imagined the whole thing. But now, sitting across from Lisa Rodriguez with David Palmer's genetic profile burning a hole in my purse, that conversation took on an entirely different meaning. "It's my mother," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "The secret child belongs to my mother." Lisa nodded, making another note. "Any idea about the time frame? When this might have happened?" The second memory hit me like a physical blow. I was 13, going through what my mother called her difficult phase. It was the summer before high school, and I had been asking uncomfortable questions about everything. Why we never visited my mother's family, why there were no photos of her from before she married my father, why she sometimes got a strange, distant look when she thought no one was watching. She had been gardening that day, something she did when she was upset or needed to think. Her hands were covered in soil, and there were tears on her cheeks that she kept wiping away with the back of her wrist. I had approached carefully, the way you might approach a wounded animal. "Mom, are you okay?" Quote. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than her years, and for a moment I saw something raw and unguarded in her expression. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd made different choices, Sarah?" It was such an unusual question from a woman who never expressed regret about anything that I didn't know how to respond. "I mean," she continued, returning to her roses with more force than necessary, "what if you'd chosen a completely different path? What if you'd been braver when you were young? Or less willing to let other people make decisions for you?" I sat down in the grass beside her, watching her hands move with practiced precision among the thorns. "Are you talking about your choices or mine?" She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Oh, sweetheart. Sometimes I think I stopped making real choices the day I married your father. Everything since then has just been maintenance. Do you regret marrying Dad?" The question hung between us like a live wire. My mother's hands stilled on the roses, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "I regret a lot of things, Sarah, but having you isn't one of them. Having you was the only thing that made any of it worthwhile." At 13, I had taken this as a compliment, evidence that despite my father's obvious disappointment in me, my mother at least valued my existence. Now, 21 years later, I understood what she had really been trying to tell me. The third memory was the most devastating because it explained everything I had never understood about my father's behavior. I was 16, and it was the night of my junior prom. I had been asked by Tommy Morrison, a boy from a good family who met all of my parents' social requirements. My mother had spent weeks planning, taking me to Hartford to find the perfect dress, scheduling hair and makeup appointments, treating the event like it was my debutante ball. My father had been working late, as usual, but he came home just as Tommy was picking me up. I was standing in the foyer in my pale blue gown, feeling beautiful and sophisticated and hopeful about the evening ahead. My mother was taking pictures, fussing with my corsage, beaming with maternal pride. When my father walked through the front door and saw me, his face changed. Not the gradual shift from neutral to pleased that I had been hoping for, but an immediate hardening, like a door slamming shut. "Who does she look like in that dress, Patricia?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge I didn't understand. My mother's hands stilled on my shoulders, the camera she had been holding dropped to her side. "Robert, please." "No, I'm serious. Look at her. Really look at her. In that dress, with her hair done up like that. Who does she remind you of?" I turned to look at my mother, confused by the sudden tension in the room. Her face had gone pale, and there was something like panic in her eyes. "She looks like herself," my mother said carefully. "She looks beautiful." My father stepped closer, and I could smell the scotch on his breath, could see the way his jaw was clenched with barely controlled anger. "She looks exactly like him. The same eyes, the same smile, the same way of tilting her head when she's uncertain. It's remarkable, really, how genetics work. Robert, stop. But he wasn't done. He circled around me like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, his voice growing colder with each word. 16 years old. The same age you were when you met him, wasn't it? When you thought you were in love with that idealistic fool who was going to change the world with his art and his poetry, and his complete lack of practical ambition. I stood frozen in the center of their battlefield, my beautiful dress suddenly feeling like a costume, my excitement about prom evaporating under the weight of adult anger I couldn't comprehend. You want to know why I can barely stand to look at you sometimes, Sarah? My father asked, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Because every time I see you, I'm reminded that my wife's heart belongs to someone else. That no matter what I've given her, what life I've built for her, what name I've put on her finger, she's still that 16-year-old girl who gave herself to a boy who painted pictures and wrote terrible poetry. My mother stepped between us then, her voice shaking but determined. That's enough, Robert. You've said enough. Tommy arrived 5 minutes later to find me crying in the bathroom while my mother tried to repair my makeup, and my father had disappeared into his study with a bottle of Macallan. The evening was ruined before it began, and I never understood why until this moment, sitting in a private investigator's office 20 years later. My father hadn't been talking about my biological father as a past tense problem. He had been talking about a man my mother had loved so completely that losing him had shaped every decision she made afterward, including the decision to give away their child. Lisa, I said, my voice barely steady, I think I need you to look into my mother's past. Before she married my father, I think she had a relationship, maybe even a marriage, that ended badly, and I think David Palmer is the son she had to give up. Lisa looked up from her notes, pen poised over paper. Any idea what name she might have been using back then? I thought about my mother's jewelry box, about the way she sometimes stared at a small, worn photograph she kept hidden behind her jewelry trays. A photograph I had glimpsed once as a child but never asked about, because even then I could sense it was something private, something painful. Her maiden name was Patricia Coleman, but I think there might be another name, something she used before she became Patricia Brennan. I'll start there, Lisa said, closing her notebook. This kind of investigation takes time, especially if we're looking at sealed adoption records and family courts from the 1980s. Are you prepared for what we might find? I thought about that question all the way home, driving through the familiar streets of Millbrook while the afternoon shadows grew longer. Was I prepared to learn that my mother had lived an entire life before the one I knew? That she had loved someone enough to have his child, then been forced to give that child away? That my father had married her knowing this secret and used it as a weapon for decades? The honest answer was no, I wasn't prepared for any of it. But I was tired of living in a house built on lies. Tired of feeling like a stranger in my own family. Tired of accepting a version of myself that had been crafted by people who couldn't see me clearly because they were still looking at ghosts from their own past. For the first time in my life, I was ready to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. 3 weeks after hiring Lisa Rodriguez, I had a file thick enough to destroy my family. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, hospital records, and adoption paperwork that painted a picture of my mother's life I never could have imagined. Patricia Coleman had been Patricia Whitman for 18 months in 1987, married to a man named James Whitman, an artist and activist who died in a car accident when their son David was 6 months old. Broke, grieving, and 18 years old, she had made the devastating decision to place David for adoption with a family in Oregon, before returning to Connecticut and accepting Robert Brennan's long-standing marriage proposal. She had buried her past so completely that even I, living in the same house for 34 years, had never suspected it existed. But now I knew. And in 48 hours, I would be sitting in the Riverside Country Club's grand ballroom, watching my father celebrate his retirement, while carrying the weight of truth that could destroy everything he had built. The morning of the retirement party, I woke up with a plan. I had spent weeks debating whether to confront my parents privately or let the secret die with me. Part of me wanted to spare my mother the pain of having her carefully buried past dragged into the light. Another part of me was tired of being the family scapegoat, tired of absorbing my father's resentment for crimes I didn't even know I had committed. But it was the phone call from David Palmer that made my decision for me. He had reached out through the genetic testing website, tentatively asking if I might be willing to share some family medical history. His message was polite, hopeful, and completely heartbreaking. He was getting married in the fall and wanted to understand his genetic background before starting a family. He had been searching for his biological parents his entire life, not out of anger at his adoption, but out of a simple desire to know where he came from. "I've had wonderful adoptive parents," he wrote, "but there's something about not knowing your own story that leaves this hollow feeling, like you're reading a book that's missing the first chapter." I knew exactly what he meant. That's when I decided that my father's retirement party would be the perfect venue for a family reunion. After all, Robert Brennan had spent his entire career revealing uncomfortable truths in public forums. It seemed only fitting that his own uncomfortable truth should be revealed the same way. The party was everything you would expect from a Brennan family production. 200 guests, live jazz quartet, 5-course dinner prepared by a celebrity chef from Hartford. My father held court like the king he had always believed himself to be, accepting congratulations and praise with the gracious humility of someone who had never doubted his own importance. I watched him from across the room, this man who had shaped my entire life through his coldness and rejection, and felt nothing but pity. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by retirement in a way I hadn't expected. The power suit had been replaced by a tuxedo that hung slightly loose on his aging frame. The commanding voice that had intimidated judges and juries now carried the subtle rasp of too many years and too much scotch. My mother stood beside him, radiant in her emerald gown, playing the perfect political wife for what might be the last time. She smiled and laughed and made gracious conversation, with the kind of practiced ease that comes from decades of public performance. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand trembled slightly when she lifted her champagne glass. She knew something was wrong. Mothers always know. Michael and Jennifer worked the room with the effortless charm of people born to privilege. Michael discussed potential business ventures with my father's law partners, while Jennifer charmed the mayor's wife with stories from the hospital. They moved through the crowd like they owned it, because in many ways, they did. This was their world, their people, their inherited kingdom. I had dressed carefully for the occasion, a midnight blue dress that was elegant enough to fit the setting but dramatic enough to make a statement. I had styled my hair in a way that emphasized the features my father had always said reminded him of someone else. Tonight, I wanted him to see exactly who I looked like. I wanted him to remember why he had spent 34 years punishing me for my mother's past. The speech began as these things always did, with my father commanding the podium and the room falling silent in response. He spoke about legacy, about family, about the values that had guided his career and shaped his children. The irony was almost too perfect. "When I look out at this room," he began, his voice carrying that familiar authority, "I see the people who have made my career possible. My colleagues, my friends, my family." He gestured toward our table, and I felt the familiar clench of anticipation in my stomach. But this time was different. This time I wasn't hoping for his approval. I was waiting for him to hand me the perfect opening. "I've been blessed with exceptional children," he continued, and I knew what was coming next. The praise for Michael, the accolades for Jennifer, and then the calculated exclusion that had defined my entire relationship with him. When he reached the moment, when he looked directly at me and delivered the line about being proud of all his children, with the exception of the failure sitting at table 12, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not the crushing humiliation I expected, not the familiar sting of public rejection. Instead, I felt a strange sense of completion, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The room fell silent. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. 200 people held their collective breath, waiting to see how the family failure would respond to being publicly dismantled by her own father. I stood slowly, deliberately, my movements calm and controlled. The broken champagne glass crunched under my feet as I stepped forward, but I didn't look down. My eyes were locked on my father's face, watching as his expression shifted from smug satisfaction to dawning uncertainty. "Thank you for that introduction, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "It's interesting that you chose the word failure, Because I've spent the last 3 weeks learning some fascinating things about family failures. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs and DNA test results. The envelope that contained 37 years of buried truth. See, I've always wondered why you could barely stand to look at me. Why nothing I accomplished was ever good enough. Why did you treat me like a stranger who happened to share your name? I took a step closer to the podium, close enough to see the blood draining from his face. But then I discovered something interesting. I'm not actually your daughter, am I, Robert? The gasp that went through the room was audible, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the space. My mother's face had gone white as her dress, and she was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. You see, I continued, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart, I decided to do some genealogy research, family medical history, you understand. Very responsible, very thorough. And I discovered that I have a half-brother named David Palmer who lives in Oregon. David, who was born to Patricia Whitman, in 1987. Quote, my father's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in my life, Robert Brennan was speechless. Patricia Whitman, I repeated, savoring each word. Married to James Whitman, an artist who died when their son was 6 months old. She was forced to give up for adoption because she was 18 and broke and had no one to help her. I pulled out a photograph, one Lisa had found in the court records from David's adoption proceedings. It showed a young woman who looked exactly like me holding a baby with my father's eyes, not Robert Brennan's eyes. James Whitman's eyes. Until she met you, of course. Robert Brennan, successful lawyer, stable provider, willing to marry a grieving widow, and give her the life she could never have with her dead husband. What a generous man. What a saint. My mother was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as 37 years of carefully buried grief finally surfaced. There's just one problem with this arrangement, I said, turning to address the crowd directly. You couldn't stop seeing him when you looked at me, could you, Robert? Every day for 34 years, you've been reminded that your wife's heart belonged to someone else first, that she loved him enough to have his child, that she only married you because she had no other choice. I placed the envelope on the podium, right next to my father's prepared remarks. So you spent my entire life punishing me for existing, for looking like him, for being living proof that Patricia Brennan was once Patricia Whitman, and that Patricia Whitman loved someone more than she could ever love you. The silence in the room was deafening. 200 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to horror to morbid fascination. At the head table, Michael and Jennifer sat frozen, their perfect world cracking apart in real time. The real failure here, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade, isn't the daughter who became a successful veterinarian despite being emotionally abandoned by her father. The real failure is the man who is so insecure, so threatened by a dead man's memory, that he spent decades abusing an innocent child. I turned back to my father, who was clutching the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Congratulations on your retirement, Robert. I hope you enjoy it. Because this is the last time you'll see me. Quote, I picked up my purse, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, chaos erupted. Voices rose in shocked conversation. Chairs scraped against marble as people stood to get a better view. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear my mother sobbing. But I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I was walking away from the Brennan family on my own terms, with my own truth, toward a future I would write myself. The broken champagne glass crunched under my feet one last time as I stepped into the cool night air, and I realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be the victim of someone else's story any longer. The first 24 hours after the retirement party passed in a strange, suspended silence. I had expected my phone to explode with angry calls, threatening text messages, or desperate attempts at damage control. Instead, there was nothing. No contact from anyone in my family, no reporters showing up at my clinic, no consequences at all except for the profound emptiness where 34 years of dysfunction used to live. I spent that first day at my veterinary practice, throwing myself into the familiar rhythm of appointments and surgeries. Animals, I had always found, were refreshingly honest about their needs and emotions. A golden retriever with a torn ACL didn't care about family secrets or retirement party scandals. A cat with a urinary blockage wasn't interested in DNA revelations or buried marriages. They just needed healing, and I could provide that in ways I had never been able to provide for my own family. But even the comforting routine of my work couldn't completely distract me from the weight of what I had done. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, my heart rate spiked. Every time the clinic door chimed with a new arrival, I braced myself for confrontation. The silence from the Brennan family was somehow more unsettling than their anger would have been. The first crack in that silence came from an unexpected source. On Tuesday morning, while I was reviewing x-rays for a German Shepherd with hip dysplasia, my receptionist knocked on my office door. "Dr. Brennan? There's someone here to see you. She says she's your sister." My heart clenched, expecting to see Jennifer's perfectly composed face ready to deliver a practiced speech about family loyalty and public embarrassment. Instead, I found myself face to face with a stranger who looked exactly like me. She was tall and elegant, with graying hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon and clothes that suggested both money and artistic sensibility. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were my eyes, the same unusual shade of green that had always made me feel like an outsider in a family of brown-eyed Brennans. "Sarah?" Her voice was tentative, uncertain. "I'm Elena Whitman. I think I might be your aunt." The conversation that followed took place in my office behind closed doors, while my staff fielded the rest of my morning appointments. Elena had driven up from New York City after seeing the news coverage of the retirement party. Yes, there had been news coverage. Apparently, publicly dismantling a prominent Connecticut family at their own celebration was considered noteworthy by the local media. "I've been looking for Patricia for almost 40 years, Elena said, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "She disappeared after Jimmy died. One day she was there, grief-stricken, but determined to raise David on her own, and the next day she was just gone, along with the baby." Elena was James Whitman's sister, an art professor at NYU, who had spent decades wondering what happened to her brother's widow and child. She had known about the adoption. Patricia had called her once, desperate and sobbing, asking if Elena could raise David herself. But Elena had been 22, broke, and struggling to finish graduate school. By the time she was stable enough to help, Patricia had disappeared entirely. "I hired investigators over the years," Elena continued, her voice thick with old regret. "But she'd changed her name, moved to a different state, and completely erased her past. It was like Patricia Coleman never existed." Sitting across from this woman who was a stranger but felt like family, I began to understand the true scope of what my mother had sacrificed. She hadn't just given up a child, she had given up an entire identity, an entire support system, an entire version of herself. Patricia Whitman, young widow and struggling mother, had died the day Patricia Brennan was born. What was she like? I asked, hungry for stories about a version of my mother I had never known. Before everything happened? Elena's face softened with memory. She was incredible, passionate, idealistic, brave. She and Jimmy were going to change the world together. He with his art, she with her activism. They were so young, so certain that love could overcome anything. She paused, studying my face. "You look exactly like she did at your age. Jimmy would have been so proud." Over the following weeks, Elena became a bridge to a family I never knew existed. She showed me photographs of my mother as a teenager, laughing and carefree in ways I had never seen. Pictures of my biological father, James Whitman, whose work as a muralist had decorated community centers and schools throughout New England before his death. Letters he had written to Elena about his hopes for his family, his excitement about becoming a father, his plans for the future that was cut short by a drunk driver on a rainy night in March. Through Elena, I also began building a relationship with David Palmer, my half-brother in Oregon. Our first phone conversation lasted 3 hours, both of us hungry for connection and understanding. He told me about growing up knowing he was adopted but loved, about the questions that had shaped his entire life, about the weird sense of completion he felt knowing he wasn't alone in the world. "I always felt like I was missing something," he said during one of our marathon conversations. "Not that my adoptive parents weren't wonderful, they were. But there was this emptiness, like part of my story was written in invisible ink." David was everything the Brennan family would have dismissed. A high school history teacher who coached soccer and spent his summers volunteering at literacy programs. He drove a 10-year-old Honda, lived in a modest apartment, and measured success by the number of students he helped graduate rather than the size of his bank account. He was also kind, funny, and possessed of the sort of genuine warmth that made you feel valued just for existing. In other words, he was everything Robert Brennan was not. But rebuilding my understanding of family wasn't the only transformation happening in my life. The veterinary practice that had always been my refuge became something more, a place where I could create the kind of environment I had always craved. I instituted new policies for treatment payment plans, ensuring that financial hardship wouldn't prevent pets from receiving care. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter, using my skills to help creatures who, like me, had been abandoned and were waiting for someone to see their worth. The change wasn't just professional. For the first time in my adult life, I began dating without the constant anxiety about whether someone would meet my family's approval. I joined a hiking group, took pottery classes, and rediscovered the joy of making art without worrying about its commercial value or social significance. It was during this period of rebuilding that I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my apartment on a Thursday evening, working on a watercolor painting of the clinic's newest rescue, a 3-legged beagle named Courage, when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw my mother standing in the hallway, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Patricia, because I was finally learning to think of her as Patricia rather than just Mom, looked around my apartment with genuine curiosity rather than the polite assessment she had always offered before. "You've made a real home here," she said, studying the artwork on my walls, the photographs of animals I'd treated, the books and plants and comfortable furniture that reflected my actual personality rather than family expectations. We talked for hours that night. She told me about James, about the brief, intense love that had shaped her entire life, about the impossible choice between keeping David and ensuring he had a stable future, about the daily weight of living with Robert's resentment, of trying to protect me from his anger while managing her own grief. "I thought I was saving you," she said, tears streaming down her face, "by never talking about your real father, by letting Robert give you his name, by trying to make you fit into his world. I thought I was giving you opportunities I could never have provided on my own." "You were protecting his ego," I said, not unkindly, but with the clarity that comes from finally understanding the whole picture. "You sacrificed my relationship with him to preserve his sense of superiority." She nodded, accepting the truth without defensiveness. "I was young and scared and so tired of fighting. I thought if I could just be perfect enough, if I could make our family look successful enough, then maybe the pain would stop. But it never did it? It just got passed down to you." The forgiveness that grew between us that night wasn't immediate or complete, but it was real. We both understood that our relationship would have to be rebuilt from scratch, based on honesty rather than performance, truth rather than protective lies. By the time she left, sometime after midnight, we had made plans for her to meet Elena, to reconnect with the family she had abandoned 4 decades earlier. More importantly, we had laid the groundwork for her to finally meet David, the son she had given up, but never stopped loving. The transformation wasn't just personal. Word of the retirement party revelation had spread throughout Millbrook's small-town network, but the response wasn't what I had expected. Instead of scandal and judgment, I found understanding and support from unexpected quarters. Clients at my practice began sharing their own stories of family dysfunction and hidden truths. The mayor's wife, a woman I had always assumed looked down on me, stopped by to tell me about her own estranged relationship with an abusive father. "Sometimes," she said, "the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone else." The Brennan family reputation, built on decades of careful image management, was indeed damaged by my revelation. But the real damage had been done years earlier, by a man too proud to love a child who reminded him of his own insecurities. I had simply made the existing dysfunction visible. 6 months after the retirement party, I was a different person living a different life. The constant anxiety about family approval had been replaced by a quiet confidence in my own choices. The defensive walls I had built around my emotions had been replaced by the selective vulnerability that comes with knowing who deserves your trust. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. For 34 years, I had been surrounded by family but completely isolated. Now, with a smaller but chosen circle of people who valued authenticity over performance, I was finally home. 1 year later, I stood in the same Riverside Country Club ballroom where I had detonated my family's carefully constructed lies. But this time, the space felt completely different. The oppressive weight of expectations and hidden resentments had been replaced by something I had never experienced before: genuine celebration. The occasion was David's wedding. After months of phone calls, video chats, and finally meeting in person, my half-brother had decided to hold his ceremony in Connecticut so that our newly reunited family could attend. His fiancée, Rebecca, was a kindergarten teacher with laugh lines around her eyes, and the kind of warmth that made you feel immediately welcomed. They had planned a simple ceremony, nothing like the elaborate productions the Brennan family specialized in, but infinitely more meaningful. Elena had flown up from New York, bringing with her a trunk full of photographs and mementos from James Whitman's life that she had been saving for this moment. Patricia, I had finally started thinking of her by her first name rather than as Mom, sat beside me in a pale yellow dress that made her look years younger. The haunted expression she had worn for decades had been replaced by something approaching peace. The most surprising guest was Michael. 3 months after the retirement party catastrophe, my older brother had shown up at my clinic unannounced. I had been preparing for another confrontation, another family member deployed to convince me to apologize and restore the Brennan reputation. Instead, I found a man who looked exhausted and strangely relieved. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, settling into the chair across from my desk. "About Dad punishing you for existing, and I realized he's been punishing all of us in different ways." The conversation that followed revealed a side of Michael the First had never seen. Behind the perfect son facade was a man who had never been allowed to make his own choices, who had spent his entire life fulfilling someone else's vision of success. He had wanted to be a teacher, like David, but had been steered toward law before he was old enough to understand what he was giving up. His marriage was a merger arranged for social and business advantage rather than love. Even his children were being groomed for predetermined roles in the family dynasty. "I'm 40 years old," he said, his voice heavy with recognition, "and I don't know who I am when I'm not Robert Brennan's son." Jennifer's awakening had taken longer, but it came eventually. The family's golden child had always believed she was exempt from our father's dysfunction because she received his approval. It wasn't until she overheard him telling a colleague that her medical career was, quote, "impressive for a woman but not really comparable to what Michael has accomplished," that she began to question the foundation of their relationship. The three of us, the siblings who had been pitted against each other for decades, slowly began building something we had never had, an actual relationship based on mutual respect rather than competition for parental approval. But the most profound change was in Patricia. Meeting David for the first time had been devastating and healing in equal measure. She had flown to Oregon 6 months after the retirement party, carrying a suitcase full of baby photos and the kind of nervous energy that comes with trying to repair a relationship with someone you gave away 37 years earlier. David, with the generous heart that had somehow survived abandonment and uncertainty, welcomed her without judgment. Their reunion wasn't the tearful, perfect movie moment you might expect. It was awkward and careful and full of the tentative steps that come with learning to love someone you should have known your whole life but didn't. "I don't need you to be my mother," David had told her during that first visit. "I had a wonderful mother who raised me and loved me, but I'd like you to be Patricia, James's wife, my biological parent, someone I can know and care about without it being complicated by expectations." That clarity had freed them both to build something new. Now watching David dance with Rebecca while Elena shared stories about his father with anyone who would listen, I felt something I had never experienced at a family gathering: belonging. The photographer David had hired was a far cry from the society photographers who usually documented Brennan family events. She was young and artistic, more interested in capturing genuine moments than posed perfection. When she asked to take some family photos, I found myself part of a group that included Elena, Patricia, David, Rebecca, Michael, and Jennifer, but notably excluded Robert. My father had not been invited to the wedding. The decision had been David's, supported by Patricia, and respected by the rest of us. Some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Some relationships are too poisoned by decades of deliberate cruelty to be salvaged by apologies or explanations. Robert Brennan was now living alone in the family mansion, rattling around in 14 rooms filled with the ghosts of the reputation he had built and destroyed. His law firm had quietly suggested he take a longer retirement than originally planned, after several major clients expressed concerns about the family scandal. Patricia had filed for divorce 3 months after the retirement party, citing irreconcilable differences that had been festering for nearly 4 decades. The last I heard, he was considering selling the house and moving to Florida, where his particular brand of cold authoritarianism might blend in better with other displaced patriarchs who had confused fear with respect for so long they couldn't tell the difference. As the evening wound down and the last guests filtered out of the ballroom, I found myself standing in the spot where I had shattered my champagne glass a year earlier. The marble floor showed no trace of that moment, but I carried the memory like a badge of honor. Sometimes destruction is the only path to reconstruction. Elena approached, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had waited 40 years to see her family whole again. "You know," she said, handing me a glass, "James would have been so proud of who you've become, not because of your career or your accomplishments, but because you chose truth over comfort. That takes courage most people never develop." "I didn't feel courageous," I admitted. "I felt terrified." "That's what makes it courage," she replied. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear." Over the past year, I had learned that rebuilding a life from scratch is both harder and easier than you might expect. Harder because you have to question everything you thought you knew about yourself, your relationships, and your place in the world. Easier because once you stop trying to fit into someone else's definition of who you should be, you can finally discover who you actually are. My veterinary practice had expanded. Word of mouth from satisfied clients had brought me more business than any amount of Brennan family connections ever had. I had hired 2 additional veterinarians and a full-time social worker to help pet owners navigate financial hardships that might prevent their animals from receiving care. The work felt meaningful in ways that earning my father's approval never had. I had also started writing. Nothing fancy. Just a blog about animal rescue and the parallels between healing wounded animals and healing wounded people. To my surprise, it had gained a following among other veterinarians and animal lovers who connected with the idea that sometimes the broken things are the ones most worth saving. David and Rebecca were planning to move to Connecticut within the year. He had been offered a position at a private school in Hartford, and Rebecca was excited about the possibility of starting fresh in a place where they could be close to the family they were still getting to know. We had already started looking at houses together, acting like the siblings we should have been all along. Even my relationship with Patricia was evolving in unexpected ways. Free from the pressure of maintaining Robert's facade, she was rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried for decades. She had started painting again, something she hadn't done since James died, and was considering taking classes at the community college. At 68, she was finally allowing herself to grieve properly for the life she had lost and the choices she had made out of fear rather than love. As I drove home that night, past the familiar landmarks of a town that no longer felt like a prison, I thought about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. The Brennan name had given me social standing, financial security, and a certain type of privilege. But it had also given me 34 years of feeling like I was failing a test I was never meant to pass. The family I was building now, with David and Elena and the parts of Patricia that were finally free to emerge, was smaller and more complicated and infinitely more real. We were connected not by shared DNA or social obligations, but by the deliberate choice to see and value each other as complete human beings. My apartment, when I finally got home, felt like a sanctuary. The walls were covered with photographs from David's wedding, Elena's art collection, and pictures of the animals I had saved over the years. On my easel sat the latest painting I was working on, a portrait of a rescue dog I had treated, eyes full of the kind of hope that survives even the worst circumstances. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, looking out over downtown Millbrook. The town looked the same as it always had, but my relationship to it had changed completely. I was no longer the Brennan family disappointment, struggling to earn a place at a table where I was never really welcome. I was Sarah, veterinarian, artist, sister to David, daughter to James Whitman and Patricia Coleman, chosen family member of a group of people who valued authenticity over performance. The truth hadn't destroyed my family, as I had feared it might. It had simply revealed that what I thought was my family was actually an elaborate performance designed to protect one man's ego. My real family, the people who loved me for who I was rather than who they needed me to be, had been waiting to be discovered all along. Sometimes the best revenge against people who tried to make you feel small is simply refusing to stay small. Sometimes the most powerful response to being called a failure is to redefine success entirely. And sometimes the child who doesn't fit the family mold is the only one strong enough to break it, so that everyone trapped inside can finally breathe free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.